so I'm going to try not to talk too much right now. Thanks for that introduction. You're probably, so the first question we were asked to talk about at the tables this morning was what brought us here, and my answer is a 22-hour flight, which was brutal, my goodness. Another thing that I wanted to start by saying is that when I was a PhD student at Berkeley, my advisor was a hard-nosed economist, and he used to say to me whenever I would get a little intimidated, he'd say, Flessa, life is a series of oral exams. So this, what I just saw here, it's the first time I've seen it. I'm familiar with Professor Mapp's research, but this is, I'm encountering it for the first time, just as you are. So I'm going to share a couple of thoughts and places to sort of provide some context to her comments, but I'm hoping more that the conversation at the tables will generate some reactions to it. So the first thing I think to know about her comments are that that there's a change happening in the United States in terms of educational policy, which is a move to a greater federal role. Education in the States is typically considered a local initiative, and there are a zillion school boards in every state. And it used to be that you could think about parental involvement or engagement as being at the school board level, that there was great influence or impact happening there. But as the move towards an increase, things that initiated under the Bush administration with No Child Left Behind and have continued with Race to the Top and President Obama, there's an increasing influence on the federal role. That to me is interesting because, at least for some ways of thinking about it, the federal government is far more distant from the local school site than a local district is. So thinking about any initiative originating in Washington that's going to have an impact in Alabama or Colorado is quite is kind of complicated. The other thing I wanted to say is that what's off the table in a kind of depressing way for parent engagement or involvement activities in the States is any conversation about socioeconomic segregation. Schools in the States are more rigidly segregated socioeconomically and racially than they were a generation ago. My mother, who went to school in the 1930s, attended a more racially integrated school than my nieces and nephews. So this is a dramatic demographic change. The most isolated children in the United States right now are upper middle class or middle class white kids. Those are the kids who are not encountering anybody who looks any different from them throughout the day. That may sound familiar. And so I think to think about parental engagement without talking about the sort of way that our lives are structured in separate ways, it means that we're not actually, what is that going to look like? And what are the purposes of schooling that we're trying to embrace when we're thinking about engaging families and communities? Are we leaving, there was a question about the status quo, are we leaving that structure as is? Or are we trying to think of more public purposes for public schooling? I also thought there was an interesting, in Professor Mapp's comments, a really interesting tension. On the one hand, she talked about policy impact, we need more of the how. I don't disagree. But then later she talked about, she didn't want to give you bullet points. She didn't want to give you a checklist. Right? She wanted to give you a framework because the how is going to look different here. That sounds to me, and I do the same thing, you'll hear it later today, that sounds to me like a little academic kind of parlor trick. Like on the one hand, I'm going to tell you you need to have some pretty strict guidelines or boxes to check. On the other hand, it's going to look different in different places. That seems contradictory to me, and I think that that's worth sorting out as we're trying to think about the policy engagement that we want to have. My understanding is that this group of leaders in this room today has the ear of policymakers and has momentum building to establish kind of baseline policies to make parental engagement get taken more seriously. What is it that folks are going to want to have in terms of implementation of policy is going to have to grapple with this. Is it a standardized, centralized approach, or is it going to be a decentralized approach that will look different in different places? And if it does look different in different places, how do you know if school A is doing a good job or school B is doing a better job? So I also enjoyed in her comments the idea of funding. She talked about incentives and inducements. think funding is a pretty explicit and interesting incentive and inducement. It will change behavior. And she also talked about the problem that she sees as being lack of training of educators. I can completely echo that sentiment. One of the most terrifying assignments I give to the student teachers in my classes in Toronto is to ask them to sit down and talk to a parent. You would think that I had asked them to, I don't know, express their most terrifying nightmare in front of somebody else. It fills young teachers with dread to try to sit down and talk to a parent. And it's not a conversation about a kid who's in trouble. It's just a conversation. So if we think about that sort of fear or that distance between school professional identity and talking to a parent who entrusts us with their child, if that distance is that hard to bridge with a newcomer to the profession, how have we socialized ourselves as educators to also reinforce that distance and that fear? So I agree with the sentiment that she was talking about. The only question I would raise, and I think she would raise it too if she were here, I mean, it is kind of funny, I get to respond to her and she doesn't have to get to say anything back, because we have the last word. Who has the capacity to do this training? To whom do we entrust this training of educators? Do we entrust it to other educators who have probably not done very well in the past? Do we entrust it to people who work in school district or ministry offices? Do we entrust it to families or community groups to do it? Who's going to do that? And I think that's a question worth considering, because I can think of some fantastic folks working in the school district level in both Canada and the United States that would do this work well. And I can think of others that I would want to put a big wall between them and a workshop leading the capacity building conversation. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, part of the problem is how do you talk about the need to make bridges and connections with parents in ways that don't reinforce deficit conceptions that they are somehow doing something wrong. So that conversation about the imperative of making those connections without saying it's their fault, not everybody knows how to lead that conversation in a very skillful way. And the final thing is that I'm always, one of the things that I study is school leadership, or in my brain that means the school principal. And I'm always interested to hear academics sort of use as the lever to fix most problems is leadership. So I'm in favor of leadership. I think this is a room full of leaders, but I also think we have to think carefully about the role of the school principal, for example, in doing these kinds of parental engagement initiatives. Again, it's a capacity question. And I'd like us to think about when something has been taken off of the plate of a principal in the past 10 years, as opposed to adding something else on. I'm not saying that parental engagement is an add-on, but I am saying that any policy initiative that requires new reporting procedures or any kind of new engagement, dual engagement with communities, that shifts what the job looks like for a school principal. And we need to think about, in a job that's already over-described, in a climate of increasing accountability and competition, how does that human being